Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C. at the Center for a New American Security, where we heard a fantastic panel discussion now on this NATO's 70th anniversary from two former U.S. ambassadors to NATO. And one of the two is joining us now, retired United States Army Lieutenant General Doug Lute, who was also an ambassador to NATO and also one of America's great soldier statesmen, because you had to struggle both with Iraq and Afghanistan, starting obviously with the Bush administration, then working through the Obama administration. And Ambassador Nick Burns, one of America's great diplomats, is going to join us here in a moment as well. Sir, the Belfer Center prepared this report, NATO at 70, an alliance in crisis. Let me first get your take, because you both have to run to another event. What are the top takeaways from your standpoint from the report? What are the crisis points? What are the good points? Because right now everybody's looking at this as an alliance in crisis, not just because of pressure Washington is putting on the alliance, but also what we're seeing from Russia, but also China, and also nationalist movements within those nations.
Well, thanks. This report is the culmination of a 6-month project authored by Nick and I, but sponsored by Harvard University, to look at alliance as it approaches its 70th anniversary. In just a couple weeks, the NATO alliance will be 70 years old. And as we began this project, we began to collect different views on both sides of the Atlantic, both European current officials and former officials, but also likewise their counterparts in the United States, on what are the big challenges that NATO faces. And we came up with 10. So if you read the report carefully, it's on the web, you'll see we lay these 10 out. We divide these 10 into 3 categories. Those challenges that emanate from within the alliance, so sort of internal challenges, starting with the one we think is most important, which is the absence today of compelling, predictable American presidential leadership of the alliance. For the first time in 70 years, we have a president who's been ambiguous about whether he supports the alliance or he doesn't support the alliance. And that has shaken the alliance confidence to its very core. We also, however, outline a series of challenges that emanate from outside the alliance borders. Here, the top on the list of the external challenges is Putin's Russia and the challenges there, for example. And I think perhaps most interesting to your audience are 2 challenges that we label as looming on the horizon. This is the arrival, the emergence of new digital technologies, which will challenge, I think, the way we think about defense technologies and their impact across the alliance. We argue that the alliance defense planning process is probably not up to task now in dealing with things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and so forth. And then the other challenge on the horizon is the increasing competition with China. And we don't suggest that NATO is going to get into the military competition of China, but we think NATO needs to wake up to the emerging commercial and political influence of China by way of investments in Europe.
Let me ask you 2 questions before you go. First, General Gerasimov is, I think we can argue, one of the world's leading military thinkers. Sadly, he's on the wrong side. And one of the things that he talks about, and he's been talking about hybrid again, and if you look at what Russia is doing, it's basically win without fighting, right? Try to undermine, use disinformation, use cyber and other hybrid techniques, combine that with military capabilities, some of it inflated, but some of it very serious, in order to get countries to change course. And we've seen Russian involvement in Brexit, the U.S. elections, France, Denmark, all across Scandinavia. Talk to us a little bit, when you're talking about this space in artificial intelligence and cyber and 5G, talk to us about how the alliance, both on a military side but on a civilian side, needs to look at this dynamic environment, because everybody's focus is, let's air police, let's do a whole bunch of raw military things, whereas actually the bigger threat might be in this hybrid campaign that's been ongoing now for years.
Well, that's actually a pretty good summary of the conclusion we draw in the report. And that is that if you think about deterrence in 3 parts of a spectrum, okay, so nuclear deterrence, conventional deterrence, and deterrence of hybrid activities, or the Gerasimov tactics, right? We argue that NATO actually knows what it's doing. It's familiar with the first 2. It's familiar with nuclear deterrence. It's quite familiar and has updated its posture in the conventional space. Where we're most vulnerable, we believe, is in the hybrid warfare arena. And here you see, as Americans, we should take this quite personally, because it was our elections in 2016 that were hacked and interfered with by Russian tactics that Gerasimov would be very proud of. But we've seen this, as your question suggests, in other NATO allies as well. That's where we need to make big investments. And these are investments that don't naturally all fall to the U.S. Department of Defense. The Department of Homeland Security, for example, the intelligence community have big roles to play in this hybrid arena. But we need to wake up to the fact that Gerasimov is onto something. And if we were not happy with Russian interference in our elections in 2016, we should wake up to the fact that 2020 is just around the corner.
And you guys were short on time, but you guys also wisely pointed out in terms of China being involved along similar tracks, and we've heard from the intelligence community how Russia and China are increasingly working together. Let me ask you the question of sort of making the case for NATO. We heard from Alyssa Slotkin, who joined us, the new member, Democratic member from Michigan, talking about, sort of explaining the case to NATO to her parents. You see that in Europe, that generation that remembered the sacrifice and anguish of World War II is dying off. The Cold War generation is now in retirement as well, and a younger group of Europeans, it breeds a kind of complacency at the end of the day, complacency which I think Russia is trying to take advantage of. What's the right way to sort of rekindle these links? The Secretary General is going to be here and he's going to be addressing Congress. That's an extraordinary move. What does the alliance have to do to better make its case to the populations so that they recognize that this is actually a strategic investment and not a cost?
So we argue that Americans need to appreciate that the value of NATO is not in the rearview mirror. It's not because NATO was successful in the Cold War or because NATO has brought 70 years of peace to Europe, but rather through the front windshield. And that is looking forward to the challenges that are before us. And this fundamentally will be the geostrategic challenge between the United States and the West and its competition with China. And the basic facts here are very, very easy, I think, to explain to most Americans. In our emerging competition with China, which will certainly be economic and political and may be military, would we rather face that competition as a democracy of one, the United States, or would we prefer to face that competition with China with the teammates? And in the form of NATO, that's 29 now, soon to be 30 like-minded democracies who are accustomed to operating together militarily and who together comprise 50% of world GDP. My vote would be to go with the teammates.
And last two, and I'll give them conjoined, and you can answer many you want. Cost plus 50 is the administration's proposal. There's this sense that it's only the president, but we saw Barry Posen also supporting a case for sort of saying NATO is OBE. What's the right way to respond to that? Is there a danger that's going to undermine the alliance? And what does Jens Stoltenberg have to tell the U.S. Congress when he speaks before them?
So the cost plus argument is a false narrative. It's underpinned by a logic that we have been altruistic, overly generous, and maybe even naive over the years. And we have allowed the freeloading of allies and been just overly generous. It's false because those investments in bases overseas and in the alliance as a whole has fundamentally been in our own selfish national interest. So we need to think hard about
the Landstuhl cases you made.
So the Landstuhl case is a perfect example. So here's a world-class Army medical facility in Germany that serves no German citizens. There are no German patients in Landstuhl Army Hospital in Germany along the Rhine. They're all wounded Americans. And so that's a classic case of how a base can be fundamentally an American interest. It just happens to be a continent closer to those casualties and therefore better able to support our troops in harm's way.
And what does Jens Stoltenberg have to tell the Congress?
I'll leave that to the Secretary General. He always finds exactly the right way to express himself. But I think he's got to express, again, this fundamental reality that the alliance has always been in American interest, but that the alliance itself also has more to do, and that there's a burden on European allies in particular to step up.
Ambassador Lute, former United States Army Lieutenant General, sir, thanks very much, and we're honored to have with us our next guest in the rotation, Ambassador Nick Burns. And we're continuing our conversation. Ambassador Nick Burns, one of America's great statesmen, is here. We just heard from General Lute, or I should say Ambassador Lute. You guys had that conversation, obviously, here at CNAS. And you have to run now to another very important event at the Atlantic Council where all the NATO Military Committee members, including Sir Stu Peach, are there. What I want to ask you is, what we talked a little bit about Nick when we were in Halifax about the importance of American leadership. The alliance, all of these burden-sharing debates existed since 1949, and yet there are greater concerns. You're very concerned about this as somebody who's been apolitical and devoted 4 decades of his life to America's security. What are some of the fundamentals here? There are those who are arguing, like Barry Posen of MIT, hey, you know what, NATO is now OBE, suggesting that the president's idea that NATO is OBE is not exclusively the president's purview. And this sort of concern that the alliance and American leadership is sort of somehow flexible and not important, that if we do less, everybody else will do more. How do you address what we're seeing right now?
The United States is the core of the alliance. We're the strongest country. We always have been since 1949. We always will be, given our economy, given the strength of our military. And President Truman and Eisenhower understood that. Ronald Reagan understood that. Bill Clinton understood that. Every president until now, Republican and Democrat, has known that it's in the self-interest of the United States to have our troops in Europe. That's how you defend the United States from Europe. We're a continent closer to the conflicts that we sometimes have to be in, defeating ISIS, contesting the Taliban in Afghanistan. One continent closer because our air and naval forces and our land forces can be based in Europe. We have been successful. We have stymied the Soviets and now the Russians for the last 70 years from thinking about invading Western Europe, which was contrary to all the interests that we have in the United States. So it's literally true. If we had never created NATO in 1949, we'd have to create something like it in 2019 and 20 to protect the United States. The Atlantic and Pacific, 18th century Americans, 19th century Americans could say realistically, the Atlantic and Pacific will protect us from the ills of the world, not in the 21st century global economy, not in the artificial intelligence world, the space world. We've got to be out where the problems are, and these are our allies. These are all countries that believe in what we believe, democracy, human rights, the rule of law. They're with us, and I was American ambassador for President George W. Bush on 9/11 at NATO. And when we were attacked and lost 3,000 people in New York and in Pennsylvania and in Washington, D.C. and Virginia, the NATO allies came immediately to our defense. We invoked the Mutual Defense Clause of NATO Article 5 the next morning, September 12th. All the allies, led by Canada, said, we'll go with you to Afghanistan. They went with us. They've suffered, the allies and partners, more than 1,000 combat deaths, thousands of their soldiers wounded. They're all still there with us today in 2019. You can't buy that kind of loyalty in the world today. And NATO is the power differential that favors the United States versus Russia. We have our allies. We can depend on them. The Russians have no allies in the world.
There's the extraordinary monument of 9/11 of World Trade Center steel that's in front of actually NATO headquarters, which is the Article 5 memorial. But let me ask you, is there a danger in terms of as a long-term challenge, because Ambassador Lute talked about sort of the buckets and the 10 ideas you guys have, but from a more long-distance strategic standpoint, we just had an opportunity to talk to the NATO, the Scandinavian NORDEFCO policy chiefs, and one of the things that's come up is there are a lot of nationalists who are driving for more defense spending to get out of collective defense agreements so that we do more for ourselves, for example. Is there a danger, and how does the alliance avoid getting someplace where in another 10, 20 years, the historic lessons are forgotten, even on the part of some Americans, right? It's not just the president who's saying this kind of stuff, that then ends up really undermining the alliance at a very time when authoritarian forces within Europe's boundaries are actually contesting and challenging some of these organizations.
NATO is obviously a military alliance, but we're also a political alliance. In the Washington Treaty, the NATO treaty, the second sentence refers to democracy and human rights and the rule of law. So we have to honor both of those. Fortunately, in most of the recent public opinion polls, a very high majority of Americans believe that NATO is still important and will be important in the future. It's hard to find a member of Congress in either of our political parties who doesn't believe that NATO is vital for us. 52 members of the Congress went to the recent Munich Security Conference with a united Republican and Democratic Party message: we believe in NATO. Maybe if the president doesn't believe in it, but we believe in NATO, and we're the elected representatives of the American people. So I actually think that NATO has a firm foundation here in the United States. And you're right, we have to keep talking to all of us as citizens about why this is in our interest, our self-interest, not charity, that the United States stay in this alliance. Thank you. I got to run.
Okay, great.
Apologize.